Thank you very much for that kind introduction. They say that if somebody speaks 2 languages, they're bilingual. If they speak 3 languages, they're trilingual. If they speak only 1 language, they're American. And I only speak English, so I apologize for not speaking in your native language. In some sense, the last group of people you want to advise you are Americans, because we are doing everything wrong in our country on fiscal policy. Under both Bush and Obama, government is getting bigger and bigger. Taxes are soon going to go higher and higher. America is going to be on a path to becoming a European welfare state. So do not follow the American model anymore. Maybe follow the American model 100 years ago, but do not follow the American model today. I am very concerned that the United States is going to become Greece. Greece is already Greece. Italy and Spain are about to become Greece. Germany and France will become Greece in 10 or 15 years. And I'm very, very afraid that in 20 or 25 years, the United States will be in that same situation where we will have spent so much money and killed the economy with such high taxes that we're going to face a fiscal collapse, a fiscal nightmare. The way I want to make my presentation is to first start with some sort of big questions that I think are very important, because unless we have a proper framework for our discussion, it's very difficult to know where we want to go. And if you look, not only in the United States, not only in El Salvador, not only in Europe, everything tends to revolve around a big fight about what is the proper role of government. You have the classical liberal vision of a small government, and that small government requires only modest levels of taxation. On the other side, though, you have the welfare state vision of a big government. And if you have a welfare state, a very large government, of course that requires a very big and burdensome tax code. Now, from the perspective of the Cato Institute, what we prefer to see is a system that maximizes economic growth. And we want a system that maximizes economic growth because if you have a bigger growing economy, that's actually the good way of generating revenue for government. Because if more people have more jobs and more companies are earning more profits, even if tax rates are low, the government will collect more revenue. And that would be sufficient to finance what are the legitimate and proper functions of government. And of course, if you have this system with a vibrant, prosperous private sector creating lots of jobs and opportunity, then people also have freedom. Because I think individual liberty matters also. And when we're thinking about this big debate between the welfare state versus the classical liberal vision of individual freedom, I actually want to quote somebody I normally don't quote, the president of Brazil. Because the president of Brazil the other day, and I'm not going to have the quote exactly right, but he basically said in a newspaper interview that you can't redistribute without first producing. Because I guess some people on the left were criticizing him for not being enough of a socialist. And he said, look, I want to redistribute, but you have to have something to redistribute. You have to let people produce something first. Now, I obviously don't think that the government should be redistributing, but at least I give the president of Brazil credit for understanding that if you just put in place a welfare state policy and everybody is poor, how can you redistribute if nobody's producing anything? If the entrepreneurs, if the business community can't create jobs, if nobody's making money, there's nothing to redistribute. So I think the president of Brazil got it half right. He understands that you have to produce. Unfortunately, he still wants to redistribute. And so when I look at this big debate between the welfare state and classical liberalism, I want to make sure we understand that growth is what is the most important thing. If you have a fast-growing, prosperous economy, It is possible, and this upsets people on the left. People on the left do not like it when some people get richer faster than other people get richer. But you know what? If you have economic growth, if you have a prosperous economy, and everyone's getting richer, even if some people are getting richer not as fast as others are getting richer, you're still better off. And if you look around the world and you compare the socialist economies versus the more market-oriented economies, you see that it's actually better to be a poor person in a rich free market economy than it is to be a middle-class person in a socialist economy. Now, of course, if you're one of the government elite in a socialist economy, you have a very good life. During the old days of the Soviet Union, the people on the Central Committee of the Communist Party had a very good life. They were called the nomenklatura. So they were the ones that got the Western consumer goods and things like that. But the average person in the Soviet Union led a very miserable life, even though they were in a society that supposedly was designed for them, because it doesn't work. Because why? As I said before, you can't redistribute if nobody's producing in the first place. This chart is sort of a mathematical explanation of what I'm talking about. If you look at the very top line, you might not be able to read it because it's far away, but the top line basically shows if you have 7% growth on average every year, it only takes you 10 years to double your economy. If you go all the way down to the bottom bar shows that if you have 1% growth, it takes you 70 years to double your GDP. Now let's think about what that means. You have countries, you have places around the world like Hong Kong that have very rapid growth for a long period of time. And what does that mean? It means that every generation you are doubling living standards in your country. People are enjoying much more prosperity. Their incomes are much higher. Their living standards are much better. On the other hand, if you only have 1% growth every year, let's say you're France, it takes you a long, long, long time to increase your living standards. Now, maybe if you're France, it doesn't matter because you're already a rich country, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. So if you're already a rich country and you're only growing 1% a year, so what? I mean, it's always good to have more growth, but if you're already rich, big deal. But if you're El Salvador and you want to become rich, you have a choice. Do you want to follow the French model and have 1% growth, or do you want to follow the Hong Kong model and have 7% growth? Now, obviously, there's no magic formula. You can't just press a certain button, you can't pull a lever and guarantee that you're going to get 7% growth. You have to have good policy, and you have to have that good policy implemented in a very fair, transparent, and non-corrupt way. So there are lots of challenges. Now let's actually look at some of the details about where El Salvador ranks. The Fraser Institute in Canada puts out an index called the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and my old employers at the Heritage Foundation put out something called the Index of Economic Freedom. And in these two indexes, El Salvador actually doesn't do that badly. You're 30 and you're 32 in these indexes. Now that's not nearly as good as being in the top 10 or 15, but it's certainly a lot better. You know, there's more than 100 countries that are being ranked in these indexes. So El Salvador has at least some of the right policies in place. But if you look at the details of these indexes, you will find that there are certain areas where El Salvador is not doing as well. Property rights, rule of law, government regulation and intervention are some of those areas. Now, why is this important? It's important because some policies are the foundation of economic growth. You have to have things like sound money, rule of law, and property rights. That's like building the foundation for a building. And then you can put a very pretty building on top of that foundation, and that pretty building are things like the tax policy, the regulatory policy, the trade policy. But unfortunately, when you're looking at El Salvador not getting a very good score on things like rule of law and property rights, those are foundational issues that are very important to address. And if you look at the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, that begins to capture the role of regulation. And you see that El Salvador falls down to 77 in the rankings. And the same, the 84 in the World Bank's index, and then 77 for the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report. So that sort of gives you a sense of where your country ranks compared to the rest of the world. Your fiscal policy, at least on paper, doesn't seem that bad, whereas you do have some work to do on some of those other areas. Having said that, though, I'm a fiscal policy economist, so that's what I like to talk about. And to the extent that these other policies aren't being fixed, you can at least offset the damage by putting in place better fiscal policy. Now, one thing I always do when I'm someplace other than the United States is I try to figure out, okay, where is the country that I'm in, where does it rank relative to America at some point in the history of the United States. And if you look at some of the data from the World Bank about per capita GDP in El Salvador, and this data is a couple of years old, but for purposes of what we're doing, it'll be fine. If you look at the per capita GDP in El Salvador, and you were to say, where was the United States at the same level of economic development, and what was the size of government? Well, when the United States had the same level of per capita GDP as El Salvador, we had a total level of government spending of less than 10% of GDP. And not only that, we didn't have any income tax at all. So when the United States was where El Salvador is today, we were truly a small government, laissez-faire, free market country. We were more laissez-faire and free market than Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has a 15% flat tax. We had no income tax. And the reason I bring this up is because so often when I'm speaking in a place like Croatia or El Salvador or Paraguay or some country that wants to get richer, some people will ask me, well, why don't we just copy Sweden or France? Because Sweden and France are richer than we are. They have high tax rates and big government, so there must not be anything wrong with high tax rates and big government. But this is where it's critically important to understand one thing. Sweden and France and the United States all became rich countries when government was very, very small and tax rates were very low, or in many cases even zero. Now let's shift to sort of the core fiscal policy issues that I think are very important as El Salvador tries to figure out what is it that we need to do to make our country richer and to create better lives for our people. In the public finance literature, you will find that there are 4 different types of spending. There's public goods, and public goods are things like national defense, legal system, public safety, rule of law, sort of the core functions of government. Those would be called public goods because, for the most part, we haven't figured out good ways for the private sector to provide those things. How do you have a private sector provide national defense? It'd be a little bit challenging. So you have these core public goods as one of the 4 categories. Another category is physical and human capital. Now, physical and human capital refers to things like highways, infrastructure. That's physical capital, human capital, things like education. Now, physical and human capital is sort of it's a more challenging category because we know that the private sector can do some of those things, but most countries around